In the low country of South Carolina, the air feels heavy with heat, river water, and memory. For more than a century, one name carried weight there in a way few families ever do: Murdaugh. Courtrooms, police stations, and front porches alike knew the name, said it with either respect, resentment, or a wary mix of both. 3 generations had served as chief prosecutors for the region. Their photographs hung on the walls of courthouses. Their wins were retold like folklore. It was a picture of a powerful Southern legal dynasty, one that seemed woven into the fabric of the place itself. People sued, people went to jail, lives turned on verdicts, and for decades the Murdaughs were somewhere in the story. That kind of power settles into a community. It becomes habit. It becomes myth. Alex Murdaugh grew up inside that myth. He inherited not just a law license, but expectations, influence to protect, money to maintain, a name to keep shining. To outsiders, his life looked complete. A successful attorney, a sprawling property in the countryside, a wife, Maggie, known for warmth in social circles, 2 sons, Buster and Paul, boys with every opportunity. It is easy to treat a family like that as untouchable. Success becomes armor. Wealth becomes explanation for every rough edge. But power also does something quieter. It gives space for secrets to grow. The cracks were slow at first, and mostly invisible unless you knew where to look. Financial pressure started long before headlines did. Alex's law practice, lavish habits, and a dependence on opioids he later admitted created a widening gap between the image of control and the reality beneath it. Bills, loans, lawsuits, expectations, the invisible weight that does not photograph well kept accumulating. When a reputation promises invincibility, admitting collapse feels impossible. So you hide it. You smooth it over. You tell yourself there will be time to fix it later. Inside the family, life carried on in rhythms familiar to Southern wealth: hunting trips, gatherings with friends, weekends near the water. Yet, one event forced the Murdaugh name into a different kind of spotlight. In 2019, a boat crash involving Paul led to the death of 19-year-old Mallory Beach. That tragedy sent ripples through the small communities that had always known the Murdaughs. Grief spread through one family. Anger and questions spread through many others. Lawsuits followed. Allegations of influence followed. For the first time in a long time, the name that usually shut doors now opened conversations about privilege. The image of a carefree son of a powerful family collided with a community mourning a young woman gone too soon. People wondered if accountability would reach everyone equally, or if connections would cushion consequences. That unease stayed like a shadow. Meanwhile, Alex's inner world was tightening. Colleagues and friends had known him as charismatic, quick with a story, always moving. But pressure isolates. When financial misconduct would later be revealed in detail, millions siphoned from clients, and his own firm had painted a picture of years of deceit layered under professional polish. To understand the scale of collapse that would soon follow, you have to see the world he built, the expectations of wealth, the fear of being exposed, the constant act of staying ahead of consequences. It was not just about money. It was about identity. Without status, without control, who was he? Maggie and Paul, in the center of this storm, were more than the labels headlines later assigned them. Maggie was remembered by friends as kind, open, someone who loved her dogs and her circle. Paul, young and impulsive, drew both affection and frustration from those who knew him, like many in their early 20s do. It is easy after tragedy to freeze people into symbols: victim, son, wife. But they were full human beings with laughter, habits, and plans that never got the chance to stretch into old age. It is here that anger and compassion meet anger at what happened, compassion for lives interrupted. The story of this family is not just about one shocking night. It is about an erosion over years. The distance between who people believed the Murdaughs were and what was actually happening widened slowly and then suddenly. Courtrooms where they once spoke with authority would later echo with evidence against one of their own. The law that had been a tool of prestige turned into a mirror. Money that once signaled stability became proof of theft and deceit. The same community that once whispered admiration now whispered disbelief. By early 2021, the pressure on Alex was reaching a breaking point. Investigations into his finances were edging closer. The lawsuits over the boat crash were moving forward. The carefully balanced tower built on borrowed money, lies, and reputation was shaking. Imagine the emotional terrain, fear of exposure, desperation to control the narrative, and a lifetime of believing problems could be managed, delayed, or explained away. No one outside the family could fully see what conversations were happening behind closed doors, what worries were spoken at kitchen tables, or what things were left unsaid out of love, habit, or exhaustion. But the direction of the storm was clear. Something was coming apart. The land around the family's Moselle property stretches wide fields, trees, and long rural roads that seem to hold sound differently, swallowing it into open space. It is easy to imagine how a place like that can feel peaceful during the day and haunting at night. On that land stood not just buildings, but history and expectation. It was there that their public story would fracture beyond repair. Before that night in June 2021, before police cars and crime scene tape, there was a sense felt by many only in hindsight that this dynasty was running out of places to hide its truths. What pulls people into this case is not just the crime itself, but the collision of themes: wealth and accountability, love and betrayal, public image and private reality. It forces hard questions about how much harm power can mask, about how communities respond when one of their most powerful is accused of the unthinkable. It invites grief for the dead and unease about the systems surrounding the living. The story is compelling not because it is sensational, but because it is deeply human: ambition, fear, denial, and collapse woven together until something breaks. As the investigation would later show, digital breadcrumbs, finances, and testimony would peel back layers that had taken years to form. But in this opening chapter, what matters is a feeling the slow tightening, the growing sense that the pillars of a revered family were hollowing out. From the outside, it still looked like success. From the inside, it was already falling. The night of June 7th, 2021, was approaching, and with it a turning point not only for the Murdaughs, but for the region that had lived in their shadow for generations. The powerful dynasty that once seemed permanent was standing on the edge of unraveling, and no one yet knew how far the fall would go. June 7th, 2021 began like so many other long summer days in the South, humid, unhurried on the surface, and ordinary in a way that makes what followed feel even more jarring. The Moselle property, with acres of fields and kennels and outbuildings, had its own rhythms, dogs barking, as moving across the land, people coming and going. It was a place meant to feel safe, a private world for family, hunting, and space from the scrutiny that had begun tightening around the Murdaugh name. That evening, Alex Murdaugh would later tell investigators that he and Paul had spent time together, that domestic routines unfolded as usual. It is often like this before life changes. Suddenly, nothing announces the fact that normalcy is about to fracture. Later that night, the world of the family split in two, before and after. When Alex called 911, his voice carried panic as he reported finding Maggie and Paul shot near the kennels on the property. Law enforcement arrived to a scene that would anchor months of investigation and eventually years of legal proceedings. 2 lives ended violently. A mother, a 22-year-old son. In the cold language of police reports, it becomes victims located. In the real world, it is something different: unfinished conversations, plans that dissolve, an absence that pulls at everyone who loved them. First responders spoke of the stillness, of the shock that clings to such scenes. Neighbors heard about it quickly. Word moves fast in rural communities, especially when the name involved is one everyone already knows. From the first hours, questions began forming alongside grief. Who could do this? Why here? Why them? Investigators started the painstaking work that never looks dramatic in real time, marking evidence, analyzing trajectories, preserving digital data, and interviewing anyone who might offer context. There were no masked strangers captured running from the woods. There was no tidy note. There was only devastation and a widening circle of speculation. The case did not exist in a vacuum. It landed in a community already aware of tensions around the Murdaughs' financial rumors, the unsolved civil questions tied to the boat crash, and a legacy of influence in local law enforcement and courts. One of the earliest threads investigators followed was technology. Modern lives leave trails, phone pings, steps recorded, videos casually filmed. Paul had recorded a brief video at the kennels shortly before the estimated time of death. In it, multiple voices could be heard, later identified by friends and family as belonging to Paul, Maggie, and Alex. That small digital moment, recorded for reasons utterly unrelated to crime, would later become a cornerstone in court. It challenged early statements about location and timelines and would loom large in determining credibility. In the age of smartphones, truth often lingers in places no one expects. As authorities attempted to reconstruct a timeline, they looked not only at where people were, but at what was happening around them. They examined vehicle movements, call logs, text messages that were sent, and those that were never opened. They noted that Maggie's phone recorded steps at a time when, according to prosecutors later, she could already have been dead, suggesting attempts to move or interact with the device afterward. Forensic evidence, ballistic analysis, and the physical layout of the property added layers to the picture. None of it came with flashing arrows. It was pieces cold, clinical, and investigators had to understand how they fit. While the investigation quietly accelerated, the public face of the story was grief. Obituaries were written, funerals held. Statements of sorrow came from friends and extended family. The stark fact that a husband had lost his wife and son drew waves of sympathy. For a time, the narrative centered on mourning and fear that an unknown killer might still be at large. Communities cope by talking, by hypothesizing, by trying to make chaos make sense. In small towns, rumor can spread as fast as fact, and in this case, both traveled widely. Yet the investigation was already tugging at deeper layers. Even before the murders, civil attorneys had been pressing for Alex's financial records in connection with the boat crash litigation. After the murders, scrutiny did not evaporate, it sharpened. Prosecutors would later argue that this pressure, combined with exposure of long-running financial misconduct, formed the backdrop to the crimes. They did not claim a moment of sudden rage alone. They described a man cornered by discovery, desperate to reset a narrative, and willing to do the unimaginable to stage himself as a sympathetic figure and delay accountability. The allegation was chilling not because it was theatrical, but because it suggested calculation entwined with utter betrayal of trust. In the months after the murders, Alex's life unraveled publicly. His law firm confronted him, uncovering years of stolen settlement funds and elaborate schemes that deprived vulnerable clients of money meant to support them after catastrophic injuries or deaths. The betrayal, there's its own wound. People already suffering trusted a lawyer with power and prestige, and that trust was exploited. The concealment had gone on for years, hidden beneath charm and legacy. When the deception finally surfaced, it cost him his job, his standing, and any remaining illusion that problems were under control. Then came another shocking twist. In September 2021, Alex reported that he had been shot on a rural roadside. That story, first described as a random attack, quickly unraveled. Authorities said it was a staged incident in which Alex had arranged for a man to shoot him so that his surviving son, Buster, could receive insurance money. The plan failed. Alex survived. What emerged instead was a portrait of a person spiraling under pressure, willing to orchestrate yet another deception involving violence. That episode further shifted public perception. Sympathy gave way to disbelief. Disbelief edged toward anger. All of this cast the murders in a different light. Investigators, now looking at a pattern rather than an isolated tragedy, focused more closely on Alex himself. In July 2022, he was charged with the murders of Maggie and Paul. He pleaded not guilty. The shock of the charges hit even in a community already inundated with revelations. A husband accused of killing his wife. A father accused of killing his own son. The emotional weight of that allegation cannot be overstated. Families are supposed to be places of safety. The accusation said the danger had come from within. As the case moved toward trial, pieces of evidence became familiar to anyone following the story: the kennel video, the shifting alibis, the phone data, the forensic findings, and the financial trail. But behind the headlines were quieter currents, friends struggling to reconcile memories of the man they thought they knew with the accusations before them, and loved ones of Maggie and Paul left to grieve in the glare of national attention. Victims in high-profile cases are often overshadowed by the spectacle surrounding the accused. Here, 2 lives were gone, and their absence persisted through every court filing and news segment. The murder night, as it became known in media shorthand, was not just one event, but a hinge. Before it, there was a dynasty wobbling under hidden pressure. After it, there was full collapse. The investigations into killings opened doors into finances, addiction, lies, and manipulations that had stretched far beyond the family home. Law enforcement revisited older deaths connected peripherally to the family. Civil suits expanded. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Murdaugh name for decades evaporated almost overnight. Yet the story resisted simplicity. It is tempting to make villains and heroes cleanly defined. Real life resists that. The case stirred conflicting emotions: grief for Maggie and Paul, compassion for those blindsided by betrayal, anger at years of impunity, and unease at how long warning signs had gone unheeded. It also raised questions about systems that allow power to concentrate so tightly in one family, and how that power can distort justice until tragedy forces reckoning. By the time jury selection approached, one truth was clear: the myth of the untouchable dynasty was gone. In its place stood a man facing charges of murdering those closest to him, along with a cascade of financial crimes he ultimately admitted. The community that once looked up at courthouse portraits of the Murdaugh lineage now looked toward the courtroom for answers. Digital data, forensic science, the slow and patient work of investigators, all of it would soon be laid bare to decide what had really happened on that June night and why. The evening at the kennels did not just end lives. It exposed a hidden architecture of deceit. In the quiet, rural darkness of Moselle, the story crossed from private family trouble into a public reckoning that could no longer be delayed. What began as a frantic 911 call will become one of the most watched trials in recent American history, a test not only of one man's guilt, but of whether power could finally meet accountability in a place it had long controlled. In the months after the murders, the narrative around Alex Murdaugh shifted from tragedy-stricken survivor to the center of a widening investigation. It did not happen in one dramatic revelation, but through a steady accumulation of facts that were difficult to reconcile with the image he had long projected. What had once been whispered suspicions became documented records, audits, and testimony. As investigators dug into his finances to understand motive and opportunity, they found not a single mistake or brief lapse in ethics, but long patterned years of theft, manipulation, and deception carefully woven into his professional life. The law firm that had carried the family name confronted him first. Colleagues who had trusted Alex discovered missing settlement funds, improperly diverted checks, and clients who had been systematically deprived of money owed to them. These were not faceless institutions. They were injured workers, grieving families, and people who had come to a powerful lawyer for help at some of the hardest moments of their lives. The betrayal embedded in that discovery cut deeply because of the imbalance of power involved. Clients trusted the name Murdaugh not just for legal skill, but for integrity. Instead, their vulnerability was exploited. When the firm forced his resignation in September 2021, the facade finally cracked in public view. On the same weekend, the bizarre roadside shooting incident unfolded. Alex reported that he had been shot in the head while changing a tire. The story initially suggested a random attack that furthered an image of a man relentlessly targeted by misfortune. But as investigators examined inconsistencies, the event unraveled. Authorities later alleged that Alex eventually admitted that he had arranged to be shot by an acquaintance so that his surviving son could receive insurance money. The plot was desperate, reckless, and revealing. It showed a man cornered by exposure and grasping for a way out, even if it meant yet another act of deception tied to violence. Alongside the unraveling of his financial crimes and the staged shooting came another admission. Alex spoke publicly about a long-running addiction to opioids. This detail did not excuse the actions uncovered, but it did provide a layer of explanation about the spiral he was in. Addiction isolates, erodes judgment, and feeds on secrecy the very conditions already surrounding his financial misconduct. The picture that emerged was of someone who had been living a double life for years, respected attorney on one side, deeply indebted and dependent on drugs on the other. It was a duality sustained by money he did not legally have, and by the confidence that his reputation would prevent serious scrutiny. As state investigators and federal agencies traced the missing money, the totals grew staggering millions of dollars siphoned through elaborate methods. There were falsified documents, forged signatures, and the creation of an account with names similar to a legitimate vendor to funnel stolen settlement funds. These were not impulsive acts born in a moment of panic. They demonstrated planning and persistence. Each discovery added emotional weight to the story, adding the voices of victims whose losses had until then been silent, compared with the attention surrounding the murders. The exposure of these crimes broadened the social dimension of the case. It was no longer just about one family's tragedy, but about the reach of one man's misconduct into the lives of many. Courtrooms that had once been places where Alex represented others became spaces where victims testified against him. People who had sat across desks from him, believing he was their advocate, now described how they had been deceived. Their stories provided a stark counterpoint to the long-standing mythology of the Murdaughs as guardians of the law. They showed how power, when unchecked, can drift into entitlement and exploitation. The investigation into the murders did not exist separately from these financial revelations. It intertwined with them. Prosecutors argued that exposure to the financial crimes provided motive, looming accountability, impending civil discovery, and the collapse of the carefully constructed persona. Emails, audits, and firm records documented pressure building in the days and weeks before the murders. The timing, prosecutors said, was not coincidence but context. For them, The killings were part of a larger pattern of manipulation, an attempt to buy time through sympathy and diversion. The defense, however, framed the financial admissions differently. They acknowledged wrongdoing and money matters, but argued that misconduct did not equate to murder. They emphasized the grief of a father and husband and suggested alternative possibilities. This tension between financial guilt and accusations of homicide would become central at trial. The public watched as two narratives developed, one about a corrupt lawyer whose schemes had come apart, and another about whether that corruption extended to the ultimate crime of killing family members. Meanwhile, other investigations radiated outward from the Murdaugh world. Authorities revisited the death of Stephen Smith, a young man found dead in 2015, and the 2018 death of longtime housekeeper Gloria Satterfield, whose family later learned that settlement money connected to her case had been misappropriated. These cases were not legally declared murders tied to Alex, but they became part of the broader re-examination of events and finances surrounding the family. They deepened public unease. How many unanswered questions had once been dismissed because of who was involved? The emotional reaction from the community evolved as the layers peeled back. Where there had been sympathy, there was now anger. Where there had been fear of an unknown killer, there was now disillusionment with institutions once considered pillars. Longtime residents described feeling betrayed not only by a man, but by a system that had allowed influence to concentrate so thoroughly that accountability seemed optional until catastrophe forced it. The story of a powerful Southern dynasty was no longer romantic. It was cautionary. At the same time, it is impossible to ignore the quieter sources of sadness in all of this. Beyond court filings and televised hearings were families altered forever. Maggie and Paul were gone. Buster faced the loss of his mother and brother, while watching his father's life collapse in courtrooms and news feeds. Friends of the victims grappled with how to mourn, while the details of their deaths were dissected publicly. The families of clients defrauded by Alex relived their own traumas as financial betrayal resurfaced in headlines. The ripples extended far beyond the confines of the Moselle property or any courtroom. The phrase secrets exposed became shorthand for the period between the murders and the trial, but it barely captures the sense of unraveling that occurred. Reputation, once the strongest currency the Murdaugh name possessed, was stripped piece by piece. Financial ledgers replaced family lore. Audio recordings replaced assumptions. What emerged was not a single revelation, but the cumulative weight of many: addiction, theft, lies, stage violence, and, according to prosecutors, calculated murder. What makes this story resonate deeply is not just the sensational details, but the way it confronts uncomfortable truths about power and accountability. It forces reflection on how communities treat those who come from prominent families, how deference can become blindness, and how systems intended to dispense justice can be distorted when those administering them are too closely tied to those they judge. It also reminds us of how fragile the boundary can be between respectability and collapse when honesty erodes. By the time the trial began, the stage was set not only for a legal proceeding, but for a reckoning with decades of accumulated privilege. The courtroom became the place where narrative and evidence would finally meet. Juries do not weigh myth. They weigh proof. Yet everyone entering that room carried the history of the name, the shock of the murders, and the long trail of financial wrongdoing that had already been admitted. The question hanging in the air was stark. After so many lies had been proven, what remained believable? The fall of the Murdaugh dynasty was no longer hypothetical. It had already happened. What remained was to determine how far responsibility for that collapse would legally and morally extend. The trial would soon offer answers, but by this point, one truth was already clear to the community that had long lived under the family's influence. Power can shield wrongdoing for a time, but secrets accumulate interest. Eventually, they come due. The trial of Alex Murdaugh unfolded in early 2023 in a courtroom that felt less like a simple venue for testimony and more like a stage where generations of history, privilege, and pain converged. Outside, television trucks lined the streets, and commentators framed proceedings as the fall of the Southern dynasty. Inside, however, the spectacle gave way to something more sober: a jury, 12 ordinary citizens, asked to make sense of a case built from grief, data, and a long trail of deception. The carved wood, the flags, the solemn routine of standing when a judge entered, everything familiar about the courtroom carried a new weight when the defendant was a man whose own family had once dominated the legal system there. From the beginning, the prosecution's narrative was stark. They acknowledged there were no eyewitnesses to the murders. Instead, they built their case like a mosaic, piece by piece, relying on digital timelines, forensics, motive evidence, and above all, credibility. Their argument centered on three pillars: opportunity, motive, and lies. They presented a kennel video that placed Alex at the scene shortly before the killings, contradicting his initial claims that he had not been there at that time. Friends and family members who knew his voice well testified that they clearly heard him on that recording. It was a small, almost mundane clip, dogs, casual chatter, but in court became a seismic piece of evidence. The prosecution walked the jury through phone data in painstaking detail: steps recorded, calls made, texts sent and left unread. They examined how quickly Alex's phone activity changed surrounding the estimated time of death, raising questions about behavior and timing. They also introduced evidence that Maggie's phone had been moved after the shootings, suggesting post-crime manipulation rather than a sudden flight of an unknown intruder. Ballistics experts testified about the ammunition types consistent with weapons owned by the Murdaugh family. None of these pieces alone were decisive. Together, prosecutors argued they painted a consistent picture that Alex was present, that the murders were not random, and that his subsequent statements to investigators were intentionally misleading. But the prosecution's case did not rest only on physical and digital evidence. They invited the jury to look at motive through the lens of Alex's financial world. Witness after witness detailed the unraveling finances, the fraudulent schemes, the missing client funds, and the looming exposure in the days leading up to June 7th, 2021. A colleague testified about confronting Alex over money the morning of the murders. For prosecutors, this was not background noise, it was the engine driving desperation. They argued that Alex killed Maggie and Paul to create a storm of sympathy, derail financial scrutiny, and reset the narrative around himself as a devastated husband and father rather than an exposed fraud. It was a theory as heartbreaking as it was chilling, rooted in the idea that the ultimate violence had been used as a tool to avoid consequences. The defense countered forcefully. They argued that the state's case relied on speculation, layered over grief, that digital footprints are open to interpretation, and that the investigation had fixated too quickly on Alex while neglecting other possibilities. They emphasized the lack of direct forensic evidence tying him conclusively to the trigger: no blood spatter on his clothes, no murder weapons recovered. They portrayed Alex as a deeply flawed man who lied about finances and drug use, but who still loved his wife and son. Their strategy was to separate financial wrongdoing from murder, asking jurors to resist the pull of moral outrage and focus on legal proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Then Alex took the stand himself, an extraordinary moment in any murder trial, made more extraordinary by his stature in the community and his history as a trial lawyer. He admitted, under oath, that he had lied repeatedly to investigators about being at the kennel shortly before the murders, blaming paranoia and opioid addiction for his dishonesty. He acknowledged decades of financial crimes, accepted that he betrayed clients and friends, and apologized, but he denied killing Maggie and Paul. His testimony was emotional at times, controlled at others, a blend of contrition and insistence on innocence regarding the murders. For some observers, hearing him admit to so many lies while asking to be believed on the central question only sharpened the issue of credibility. Jurors listened not only to words, but to inconsistencies. The prosecution returned repeatedly to the kennel video, to shifting alibis, and to the implausibility they argued was embedded in Alex's version of events. They argued that his ability to manipulate people for years through charm and authority was not a side note, but a central trait. If he could deceive colleagues, clients, and even close friends about millions of dollars, could he not also lie about something worse? The defense insisted that this leap was too great, that guilt in one arena cannot automatically be extended to another. The jury, silent by law and training, absorbed it all. Beyond the legal arguments, the trial carried a relentless emotional current. Family members sat through graphic descriptions of scenes they would give anything to undo. Community members saw their institutions laid bare. Former colleagues testified against a man they had laughed and worked with for decades. The photographs, recordings, and evidence were not abstract. They carried the weight of real people whose lives had intersected with the Murdaughs in ways both ordinary and devastating. There were moments when the courtroom was so quiet that the hum of electronics seemed loud. When closing arguments arrived, they reflected the stark divide at the heart of the case. The prosecution framed Alex as a man whose life was collapsing, who saw the murders as a way to buy time and sympathy, and whose lies had finally caught up with him. They invoked the digital record, the kennel video, and the financial crisis converging around June 7th. The defense urged jurors to resist narrative temptation, warning against convicting on emotion or anger at his financial crimes rather than clear proof of murder. They reminded the jury that the burden rested entirely on the state. Deliberations did not stretch on for weeks, as some had predicted. When the jury returned, the courtroom held a breath as old as justice itself. The verdict was guilty on both counts of murder, along with related weapons charges. Alex Murdaugh, descendant of a legal dynasty, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The words were simple, almost spare, but their implications rippled outward. The myth of untouchability was not only cracked, it was finished. The legal system that had once seemed to bend around a Murdaugh name now rendered a judgment against it. In the aftermath, reactions were layered. For some, the verdict restored faith that even the powerful can be held accountable. For others, it could not erase the grief of lives lost or the unanswered questions about how such a collapse had been allowed to grow unchecked for so long. Maggie and Paul remained gone. The community still lived with the reverberations of a case that had exposed structural failures, from deference to conflict of interest risks in small legal ecosystems. The trial closed a legal chapter, but it did not heal every wound. There is a human tendency to look for neat lessons in tragedies, but this story resists simplification. It is about the darkness that can grow behind polished facades, about how privilege can both protect and corrupt, and about the slow erosion of integrity long before violence occurs. It is also about the strength of evidence in the modern age, how digital traces and recorded moments can outlast lies. Above all, it is about people, victims whose lives ended too soon, families forever altered, clients betrayed, and a community forced to confront the power dynamics in its own institutions. The Murdaugh family murders remind us that the concept of dynasty can be double-edged. Power can build courthouses, fund scholarships, and win cases, but it can also insulate wrongdoing until the cost becomes unbearable. When truth finally surfaced here, it did so through the combined work of investigators, prosecutors, forensic experts, and citizens on a jury who carried none of the old alliances or myths into their verdict. The reckoning was not just legal, it was cultural. As the courtroom emptied after sentencing, the photographs of past Murdaugh prosecutors still hung in county buildings, facing a community now changed by what had unfolded. Their legacy, once uncomplicated in public memory, now sits alongside the reality of a descendant convicted of murdering his own wife and son and admitting to massive financial crimes. History rarely offers such stark contrasts within one family line. The story does not conclude with dramatic closure. There will be appeals, civil suits, and ongoing reckoning for years. But one era ended decisively. A name that once symbolized authority in the justice system now stands as a warning about the perils of unchecked power and the devastating consequences when deception becomes a way of life. In the end, the forces that unraveled the dynasty were not rivals or external enemies. They were truth, time, and the weight of its own secrets.